When I walked through the front door that evening, something felt off. Normally, I'd be greeted by the familiar sounds of Megan cooking in the kitchen or humming along to the radio. But this time, the house was quiet, too quiet. I stepped into the dining room and froze. Megan was sitting at the table with an open bottle of red wine and 2 glasses. Megan wasn't the kind of person to drink without a reason, so seeing her like this set off alarms in my head. Her fingers were wrapped tightly around her glass, her knuckles almost white. She looked calm at first glance, but I knew better. Her eyes told a different story, one of unease and maybe even guilt. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice light. I set my keys down on the counter. "What's all this? Are we celebrating something?" She gave me a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sit down, John. We need to talk." It wasn't the words themselves that made my heart sink. It was the way she said them, like she'd practiced, like this moment had been playing in her head for days. I sat down slowly, my chest tightening as dread began to creep in. "Megan," I said, carefully, "what's going on?" She took a sip of her wine, her gaze drifting away before finally locking onto mine. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she started. Her tone was steady, but I could see her struggling to keep it that way. "About us. About our marriage." My stomach churned. "What do you mean? Did I do something wrong?" She hesitated, and for a moment, I saw the Megan I'd known for over 20 years, the woman I'd built a life with, raised a family with. When she finally spoke, her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I feel like I've lost myself," she said. "I've been your wife, the mother of our children, but somewhere along the way, I forgot who I am." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "Megan, we've built a good life together. What are you saying?" Her grip tightened on the glass. "I'm saying I need to figure out who I am again, to find out what I want. And you don't think you can do that with me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes. "I need space, John. I need to step outside the boundaries of our marriage to figure things out." It took me a moment to process what she was saying. When the realization hit, it was like the ground beneath me had vanished. "You want to see other people?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Just for a while. I need to understand myself." Silence filled the room. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, and my mind was racing. I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for so long, feeling a mix of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. Eventually, I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. "I need some air," I said, my voice flat. Without waiting for her response, I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door. The night air was cool against my face, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. I drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring as my thoughts spiraled. After what felt like hours, I found myself parked outside a 24-hour diner. The neon sign buzzed softly in the stillness. Inside, I ordered a coffee I didn't plan to drink and slid into a booth in the corner. I needed to think, to process everything. Then it hit me. I needed proof of what Megan had said, something tangible to hold on to remind me I wasn't imagining this nightmare. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app. Pressing record, I slid the phone into my pocket. When I finally went back home, Megan was still at the table. Her glass was empty now, and she looked up as I walked in. "I'll be meeting someone for dinner this Friday," she said softly. "I'll be back Saturday morning, and we can talk more then." Her words felt like nails being hammered into the coffin of our marriage. I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. Later that night, I sat alone in our bedroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me was a stranger, haunted, pale, and older than I remembered. I pulled on a sweatshirt, each movement feeling mechanical, and sat on the edge of the bed. I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed help. Grabbing my phone, I called Sophie, our daughter. "Hey, Dad," she said brightly. "What's up?" "Sophie," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "I need you and Luke on the line. It's important." Her tone shifted instantly. "Are you okay? What's going on? Just trust me. Can you get Luke?" A few moments later, we were all on a conference call. I hesitated for just a second before playing the recording. As Megan's voice filled the silence, my chest tightened. When it ended, Sophie was the first to speak. Her voice was trembling, but it wasn't from fear. It was from anger. "What the hell, Dad? She wants to date other men to fix your marriage?" Luke, usually the quiet one, let out a low curse. "She's out of her mind, Dad. She's throwing everything away." I exhaled slowly, my shoulders slumping. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. I needed you both to hear it from her." "We'll figure this out," Sophie said firmly. "She doesn't get to tear this family apart without a fight." Luke agreed. "We've got your back, Dad. Always." For the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of hope. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. It was hard to breathe, let alone think clearly, but there was one thing I knew for sure. My kids were my anchor. Sophie and Luke had stood by me, their voices strong and unwavering. With them by my side, I felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in months: clarity. The fog in my mind had lifted, replaced by a sharp resolve. This wasn't just about me. Megan's betrayal had torn through the family we built together, and I couldn't let her walk away without facing the consequences. I made myself a cup of black coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. There was one name at the top of my call list: Margaret Pierce. Years ago, a friend had introduced us. She was one of the best divorce attorneys in the city, known for being tough, strategic, and unflinching. I never thought I'd need her help, but now, she was the first person I called. When she answered, her voice was professional and to the point. "Margaret Pierce speaking." "It's John Lawson," I said, my voice steady but tight. "I need your help." She didn't waste time asking too many questions. Instead, she scheduled a meeting for later that afternoon. "Bring everything you've got," she said. "The more evidence, the better." That afternoon, I found myself in her sleek downtown office. The place had floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a clear view of the city skyline. Margaret, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, greeted me with a firm handshake. "Let's get to work," she said, motioning for me to sit. I laid everything out in front of her: the recording of Megan's confession, screenshots of text messages I'd found on her phone, and printed emails between her and a man named Vincent. The messages weren't subtle. They left no doubt about what was going on between them. Margaret reviewed everything with a calm, analytical eye, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious. "This is solid evidence," she said. "It clearly establishes adultery. This will work heavily in your favor during the divorce. We can argue for a larger share of the marital assets, and with your children supporting you, we'll have an even stronger case." I nodded, my jaw clenched tight. "I don't just want a settlement, Margaret. I want her to feel the weight of what she's done. She's not just betraying me. She's betraying our family." Margaret gave a small, approving smile. "We'll make sure of it." For the next hour, we mapped out a plan. Margaret suggested serving Megan the divorce papers at a public moment, one that would leave an impression. We agreed on Friday night, during her date with Vincent. The setting, Margaret explained, would make the consequences of her choices impossible to ignore. The days leading up to Friday were a whirlwind. Sophie, Luke, and I worked together like a team, packing up Megan's belongings and clearing out her presence from the house. Sophie was relentless. She packed boxes with swift, almost angry movements, muttering under her breath. "She doesn't deserve to stay here," she said, shoving a pair of Megan's designer shoes into a box. "This house belongs to us, not her." Luke was quieter, but just as determined. He carried box after box out to the car, his expression unreadable. At one point, he paused to say, "She made her choice. Now she has to live with it." By Friday morning, the house was nearly empty of Megan's things. I had arranged for a storage unit near her parents' home, and everything was scheduled to be delivered there. I'd even changed the locks. The house felt different, lighter, freer, as if it had shed the weight of betrayal. Standing in the living room, I took a deep breath. "This is it," I said to myself. "Tonight, everything changes." That evening, Megan walked into an upscale restaurant, wearing a stunning red dress. Her hair was styled perfectly, and she looked confident, almost radiant. It was clear she felt like a new woman, ready to embrace this so-called freedom she thought she wanted. Vincent was already waiting for her, pulling out her chair with a smile. The restaurant was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. It was the kind of place meant for romance and intimacy, and Megan was soaking it all in. Their conversation seemed effortless, marked by laughter and lingering glances. Megan sipped her wine, enjoying the moment, when suddenly, a voice interrupted the flow. "Mom." Megan froze, the color draining from her face as she turned to see Sophie standing there. Her voice was cold, sharp, and full of fury. "Sophie," Megan said, her smile disappearing. "What are you doing here?" Sophie ignored Vincent completely, her focus locked on her mother. "I could ask you the same thing," she said. "Out here on a date while Dad's at home, picking up the pieces of the life you shattered." Megan opened her mouth to respond, but Sophie didn't let her. "How could you do this to him? To us?" By now, other diners were starting to notice. Whispers rippled through the room as heads turned to watch the unfolding drama. Megan leaned forward, her voice a strained whisper. "Sophie, please. Let's not do this here." But Sophie wasn't backing down. "You didn't care about humiliating Dad, so why should I care about your embarrassment?" Before Megan could say another word, a man in a suit approached their table. He held a thick envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Megan Lawson?" he asked, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. Megan's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. "Yes, that's me," she said weakly. "You've been served," the man announced, placing the papers firmly in her grasp. The room fell silent. Megan sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at the divorce papers in her hands. I sat there, staring at the empty chair Vincent had just gotten up from. He barely said anything before he rushed out, leaving me alone in the mess I had created. Sophie's words were still ringing in my ears. "You brought this on yourself." Her voice had been low, but it cut deep. Then she turned and walked out, leaving me humiliated under the watchful eyes of strangers. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room buzzed with whispers, a weight pressing down on me from all sides. When I finally got home that night, panic hit me hard. My key didn't work. I tried it again, but the lock had been changed. I knocked on the door, then pounded harder, feeling desperate. "John," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Let me in." My phone buzzed in my hand, startling me. It was John. His voice came through cold and steady, a tone I barely recognized. "There's a letter in the envelope I left for you. Read it. Everything you need to know is there." Before I could say anything, the line went dead. With shaking hands, I ripped open the envelope. The letter inside was short, but it hit hard. "Megan, you made your choice, and now I'm making mine. You've been served with divorce papers citing adultery. Your things have been moved to a storage unit. The key and address are in the envelope. Don't contact me except through my lawyer. Sophie and Luke are with me. These are the consequences of your actions. Live with them." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My knees buckled, and I sank to the cold ground outside the house I once called home. Tears streamed down my face as I read the letter over and over, hoping it would change. But it didn't. I tried calling Sophie. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Then I called Luke. Same result. The silence from my kids hurt more than I ever expected. After sitting there for what felt like forever, I pulled myself together and drove to the address John had given me. The streets were quiet, and the drive felt like it took forever. My mind was a blur of memories, regrets, and unanswered questions. The storage unit was small and cold. I unlocked it with the tiny key and found rows of boxes. Each one had my name on it, a cruel reminder of how my life had been packed up and taken away. I sat there for hours, going through the boxes. Photos, keepsakes, clothes, fragments of a life I had broken. By the time I left, the sun was coming up, and I felt like I'd aged years in one night. Monday came too soon. Walking into the office felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Whispers followed me everywhere, and I kept my head down, not meeting anyone's eyes. It didn't take long to figure out why. Someone had recorded the scene at the restaurant. The video of Sophie confronting me had gone viral. Strangers online were tearing me apart, calling me selfish, unfaithful, and a disgrace. By mid-morning, my boss called me into his office. He didn't waste any time. "Megan, I'm sure you've seen the video. This kind of publicity is bad for you, and worse for the company. Effective immediately, you're on indefinite leave." I left the office in a daze, my career slipping away just like everything else. I had expected anger and rejection from my family, but this was different. My actions had become public, and the judgment of the world was crushing. In the weeks that followed, I tried reaching out to Vincent. His replies were brief, distant, and then they stopped. "This isn't what I signed up for," his final text read. I couldn't blame him. The mess I had created was too big for him to handle. Alone in my tiny apartment, the days blurred together. I scrolled through old photos of John, Sophie, and Luke, longing for the life I had taken for granted. Each picture was like a knife to the heart, a reminder of what I had lost. One night, while scrolling through social media, I saw a post from John. It was a picture of him, Sophie, and Luke at dinner. They were smiling. The caption read, "Stronger together." Tears streamed down my face as I stared at the screen. They were happy. They were thriving. And I was alone. The loneliness was unbearable, but it forced me to face the truth. I had spent so long blaming my unhappiness on others, thinking that an affair would fix what was broken inside me. It hadn't. It had destroyed everything. I decided to seek therapy. It wasn't easy. The sessions were raw, pulling apart every lie I had told myself and forcing me to face my insecurities. But slowly, I began to understand why I had made the choices I did and how wrong they were. I started volunteering at a community center. It was a small step, but it gave me something to hold on to as I worked to rebuild my life. I also wrote letters to Sophie and Luke. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I knew I didn't deserve it, but I wanted them to know I was sorry. At first, there was no response. Then, weeks later, Sophie replied. Her messages were cautious, filled with pain and anger, but they were a lifeline. We started talking more, slowly working through the damage I had caused. Months turned into a year. I found a new job, not as glamorous as my old one, but fulfilling in its own way. My relationship with Sophie and Luke was fragile, but it was something. I clung to every interaction, no matter how small. John, meanwhile, had fully moved on. He was happier, stronger, and even dating again. I could see it in the way he carried himself, in the smiles he shared with our kids. One day, I got a letter from him. It was short, acknowledging my efforts to make amends and wishing me well. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a kind of closure. I held the letter to my chest and let out a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, I felt a small bit of peace. My journey wasn't over, but I was finally on the path to healing.